Today we're going to learn Eruvin, Daf Kaf Gimel. Today's shiur is sponsored by Medina Korn in memory of her dear mother Rosalie Kachin, Shoshana Rezel Bat Avraham Yoshua Vebela Toiba, Zichrona Levracha, on her 20th year at site. She loved to learn Torah and connect with people and would have loved the incredible work Hadran is doing in promoting both of those values. And in honor of teachers and students who are starting school today in these uniquely complicated circumstances, a lot of credit to teachers who are both going out and risking their lives and also working very hard to figure out how to teach children in a different type of environment. So b'hatzlacha to everybody. Okay, we saw in the Mishnah at the end of the page yesterday, let's just review the Mishnah. We had the machloket Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava that we saw beforehand already, which is the be'er, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda, everything is allowed, a bor, a be'er, as long as they're either public, okay? If it's public, it's allowed even if it's rainwater, because we said that they'll remind each other, right? In case the water dries up, people will remind each other. And the second thing we said was that even, he said, a be'er that belongs to an individual is allowed because it's got mayim chayim, it has fresh water, and we're not worried it's going to dry up. By the way, Shuli Mishkin this week in Flashback wrote all about different types of water and cisterns, and it's a good read there if you want to learn more about what water was like in those days and how things were. The second opinion was Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, who says, Ein osim pasim ela lebe'er harabim bilvad. He says it's the only case it's allowed, okay, he's much more strict, is only in a public space and only if it's a be'er which has fresh rainwater, fresh spring water going through, because it will never dry up. Anything else you have to put around the ropes, right, up to a height of 10 tefachim. So now the question is, who do we hold like? So our Gemara starts off and says, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So Rav Yosef passes down the name of Rabbi Yehuda and the name of Shmuel, that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and it's only allowed pasei b'ra'ot in a public well. But Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, he also said the same thing in the name of the same people in a different place, and he said, Lohutchu pasei b'ra'ot ela lebe'er mayim chayim bilvad. The only place where we allow pasei b'ra'ot is in fresh water. So this sounds kind of like the same thing, right? Each one kind of focuses on one be'er versus bor, one rabim versus yachid, but it's, something belonging to many rather than an individual, but they kind of basically say the same thing. So the Gemara is going to say, why did he need to make both statements? Utsricha, you needed both. Why? If you had said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, havamina de rabim va'afilu mechunasin. You might have thought if you just said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, he disagrees with Rabbi Akiva on two counts, on many versus individual, because Rabbi Yehuda thinks be'er of yachid is okay, a well of an individual is okay, and he disagrees with him about be'er versus bor, well versus pit, or rainwater pit. So he says you might have thought that he's only disagreeing about the rabim issue, but afilu mechunasim, even if it's rainwater, as long as it belongs to many, maybe it would be okay. Now you could then have to say, well, why did he say be'er harabim then? Well, he was just trying to say against Rabbi Akiva, and that's why he said be'er, but not that he meant really only a be'er, that his focus was rabim, it has to be owned publicly and not one that's owned by an individual. In other words, you might have thought that maybe what he was saying was it's only for fresh rainwater, but not necessarily for rabim. So basically, because of that, he needed to say both. If we just had the teaching that Rav Yosef said in the name of Rav Yehuda and the name of Shmuel that we only allowed for fresh water, what might you have thought? Each one's focusing on a different element. One is focusing on the be'er versus the bor, that's the be'er mayim chayim, and the other one is focusing on the many versus the individual. And therefore, you had to say both, in order to get both, that it's only fresh water, well, and that it's only rabim, only if it belongs to, it's a communal one, we needed to say both things. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to have a very long Mishnah, or pretty long Mishnah, with many, many different opinions about different things. There's kind of two machlokot here. They're not necessarily the same. Okay, there's two issues going on, but there's a lot of opinions. And if you see on the sheet, I brought the Mishnayot from Mishnah Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. Okay, we're in Mishnah Hey right now, but the Gemara is going to go back and make references to things earlier. So on the sheet that I prepared, just to make it easier for you, you can look and see that all the Mishnayot are there, and we're going to go back to them soon. So it's there for you to have. We'll use it as we need. The first thing is Ve'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Now, if you remember, we just ended our previous Mishnah with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So now the Gemara said, the Mishnah starts off, and furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, which the Gemara is going to say, why does it use the word Ve'od? It's not so commonly used in the Mishnah, although we'll see some cases where it is used. But anyway, they're going to ask, why does it say Ve'od? But in any case, let's just read the Mishnah first. Ve'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said, Hagina v'hakarpaf shem shiv'im amav v'shirayim al shiv'im amav v'shirayim. Okay, 7 2/3 by 7 2/3. Remember, that's our square shape of where we're going to get to a Beit Sa'atayim. Okay, let's just review, and this is going to be important today. We're going to finally find out today where we got the square from. Yesterday or 2 days ago, we had the square, and it wasn't so clear. Where does this square come from? Because really, it's all learned from the Chatzer Mishkan. The courtyard of the Mishkan, which we're going to learn today, was not only a courtyard of an entranceway to the Mishkan, but it included the Mishkan in the Chatzer, was 50 by 100, which was not a square. But if you take that amount, you get to 5,000 square cubits, which now we're going to say is the same thing, basically. Okay, we'll get to the math later on today, but it's really 7 2/3 by 7. It's really 70.71. Okay, if that's how you would get to basically, or it's a little bit more of a fraction of that, but approximately that would get you to 5,000 square cubits. But because, and the Rambam even says it's a very complicated number, and no one really gets to that complicated number, so they made it a round number of 70 2/3. Okay, they're going to call it in this Mishnah 70 and shirayim. Shirayim is a remainder, meaning, and some sort of fraction. They don't even get into details what the fraction is, but it was known that it's 70 2/3, but that actually gets us up to 4,994 square cubits. It doesn't get you to the full 5,000. We'll get back to this issue in a bit. So he says two things. Number one, he says, if it's 70 amav v'shirayim al 70 amav v'shirayim, if you have a karpaf, we're now moving away from pasei biraot and we're moving to laws of karpaf. If you remember, and this you can look in the Mishnah on the page, Rabbi Yehuda had said Beit Sa'atayim is the maximum for this pasei biraot. Any more than that doesn't work. To that, the rabbis responded. This is on Yuched Amubet. The rabbi said, Amru lo amru be'etz Mishnah Gimel here, lo amru Beit Sa'atayim ela legina v'karpaf. Meaning, right, the measurement of a Beit Sa'atayim is not important for Pasei Biraot. It was said, according to the rabbis, about a garden and a karpaf. Remember, a karpaf is this area that's not generally meant, it's a big space that might have walls, but it's not generally meant for living. And because of that, when it's larger than a Beit Sa'atayim, we already treat it halachically as what we call a karmelit. It's a big space. It's not exactly a public space, but it's also not a private space. And therefore, carrying in that space is going to be forbidden. So since the rabbis brought that up, now we're going to get into laws of karpaf, basically. So now we're going to see a bunch of different opinions. Until now, we assumed karpaf generally is not mukaf l'dira. You don't usually live there. If it's bigger than Beit Sa'atayim, it's a problem. But now we're going to learn a few other opinions about it. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, Gina v'karpaf, a garden or a karpaf, because a garden you also don't live in. Shehem shivim amav v'shirayim al shivim amav v'shirayim. Hamukafot gader gavoa 10 tvachim. If it has a wall, 10 tvachim tall. Mitaltalim b'tocha. You can carry inside, meaning, because why? It's up to a Beit Sa'atayim, including, right? A Beit Sa'atayim is okay. It's more than that that's a problem. However, he has a huge, strict halacha here, and he says, only if ubavad sheyeheba shomira o beitira o shetei smucha le'ir. It needs one of the following three. Either it needs a hut of a guard, meaning that it has to be somehow used for living space. Either there's a guard living there, or like a guard booth where someone would live, or a beitira, or some sort of a little house, or it has to be close to the city. There's a debate about what. Some people say it's exactly this 70 2/3 amma away from the city, which means it's close enough to the city, just like we use that amount for Eruv Tchumim to say you can still continue as long as there's huts at that distance. So if it's close enough to the city, then one might likely use it for living space because it's close to the city. The more farther away you are from the city, the less likely anyone's going to actually live there because people don't live so far outside the city. It's exactly the same logic as the Eruv Tchumin. It's basically an extension of the city because someone might be living there. So he basically adds what we didn't have before. We thought if it's a Beit Satayim, it's fine, even if nobody lives there. Now we're going to learn it has to be, according to him, used for some sort of living purposes. That's opinion number one. Opinion number two is an in-between, which is the Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda omer, afilu ein ba'ela bor v'shiach u'ma'ara metaltalim b'tocha. As long as it has something that people use for some sort of living use, meaning not for sleeping purposes, but for drinking. If there's a bore where they would collect rainwater and they would use the water. If there's a shiach or ma'ara, these are all basically different types of, shiach is known to be a ditch. It's usually long rather than a bore is usually round. A ditch is usually rectangular. And a ma'ara, we usually say is a cave. In this case, what they really mean is something dug underground with a cover, kind of like a cave, but it's really a place for holding water. Okay, so these, if it has one of these three, then because it serves man in some way, it's enough to call it hukaf l'dira, that if it's not yet more than a Beit Satayim, we will allow it. Okay, so he has an in-between. Has to be somewhat hukaf l'dira, but not exactly dira, not exactly living, but useful for people. Rabbi Akiva omer, afilu ein ba'achat mikol elu metaltalim b'tocha. It doesn't need any of these criteria. What does it need? What's the most important? It can't be any more than 70 2/3. Remember his language here, because we're going to go back to this, because the way I'm translating it is the way the Gemara is going to translate it later. It can't be any more than 70 2/3. Okay, keep that in mind. That's what it sounds like, because that's the condition. Ubilvad shev. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said, ubilvad, that it's hukaf l'dira, right? It has to be for some sort of living purpose. He says the main important thing is the size. Okay, any more than 70 2/3 will be a problem. We'll get back to this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, now we're moving on to a different issue. Now the issue becomes the size, the shape. Okay, the size we dealt with, and the issue really in the first part is, do you need it to be surrounded for the purposes of living or semi-purposes of living or not, in order to allow carrying it in any, right? This is all until you get to a Beit Satayim. Even until that amount, maybe a wall is not enough. It has to have some sort of living space or living something, according to two of the opinions. According to Rabbi Akiva, it doesn't matter. Now we get to, is it rectangular or is it square? Okay, Rabbi Eliezer omer imaita orka yeter al rochba afilu ama achat ein metaltalim b'tocha. Now, all the opinions before, if you noticed, all described it in 70 2/3 as a square. So the pshat here, although we'll see that later the Gemara doesn't understand it this way, is that Rabbi Eliezer is saying if its length was any more than its width, which basically means if it's not a perfect square, even by 1 amma, okay, maybe a little less than an amma, we can't exactly measure perfectly to get the most perfect square, but if it extends more than an amma in one direction and it's no longer a square, that's no good, okay? Again, we're going to have to see, where does this whole thing of the square come up? Rabbi Yossi omer, afilu orka pishnayim berochba metaltalim b'tocha. Rabbi Yossi says no. It can be up to 2 times the amount based on the courtyard of the Mishkan, which was, right, 2 times the amount. It was 50 by 100. So the length was twice the width. So therefore, it can be exactly that. But more than that is a problem. Amar Rabbi Eli, Shamati mi Rabbi, it should be Rabbi Eliezer, most people correct it. I heard from Rabbi Eliezer the following 3 halachot. One connects to us, 2 don't, one at least peripherally, the other not at all. But there's going to be something common about these 3 things he learned from Rabbi Eliezer. We'll see that at the very end of the Mishnah. I learned from Rabbi Eliezer 3 things. Number 1, afilu hi kebeit kol. It doesn't matter the size. It could even be a beit kor. A beit kor is 30 se'ah, which is basically 15 times the size of a Beit Satayim, is still okay. Okay, he said that that's okay. That's number 1. V'chein shamati mimenu, anshe chatzer sheshachach hacha behem v'lo irev, beito, v'lo irev, if we have a common courtyard, and we all did an Eruv together, except for one person living in the courtyard, what do we do generally? We say if it's Shabbat and he can no longer be part of our Eruv, he basically says on Shabbat, I give up my reshut, my property, my possessions to everybody in the Chatzer. At that point, the question is, what's allowed from his house? Okay, generally, what is an Eruv Chatzerot? It allows me to take stuff from my house outside and from outside to my house, as long as we're within the courtyard. So if we did it, but I wasn't part of the Eruv, let's say. So what happens? Beito asur milachnis ulahotzi lo, aval lahem mutar. He's not allowed to take things. Okay, let's say it was me. I didn't join the Eruv, but what did I do? I said, well, I cancel. You can basically, what we call in Hebrew, a mafkir. I basically say everything is hefker, nothing belongs to me in my house. So everyone else kind of becomes the owner of my house. In that case, since I didn't join the Eruv myself, I can't take items out of my house or bring them in. However, everyone else in the Chatzir, since I gave up my property to them, they can all bring things into my courtyard, into my house if they want. Okay? So they're allowed amna. That's another thing Rabbi Eliezer taught. And the third thing is, v'chein shamati mimenu. By the way, you notice all these are leniencies. Sheyotzim ba'ar kablin bepesach. What is this? Ar kablin? It's some sort of vegetable that they used for maror. Okay? For the maror on Pesach, the bitter herbs. He said that you can use this type of vegetable. There's a whole debate. We'll get to Pesachim, what vegetables are allowed. He had this opinion that ar kablin were allowed. But what's common about these three things that he heard Rabbi Eliezer say? Chazarti al kol tamidav ubikashti lichaber v'lo matzati. Nobody agreed with me that Rabbi Eliezer said this. Nobody else heard him say it. So basically what Rabbi Eli is saying is I'm a little bit doubting my opinions. Okay, so number one, what would they disagree about? They'd say, number one, Beit Kor isn't good. You need Beit Sa'atayim only. Number two, Anshe Chatzer can't carry into your house. If you didn't belong to you're not part of the Chatzer, so they're allowed to carry everywhere else, but nobody can carry into your house. And akrablin is not a proper vegetable for the bitter herbs on Pesach. So basically he says, listen, I really believe that Rabbi Eliezer said this, but I found no one who could agree with me about it. Now the Gemara is going to start. My Tana de Katani ve'od. Why did the Mishnah use the word ve'od? And additionally, ilema, remember, ilema means if we're going to say im nomar, it's made up of two words. In Aramaic, a lot of times they stick two words together as one long word. Ilema is im nomar, meaning if we are to say, which always means we're going to reject it. If we're going to say this, well, it doesn't make sense because of that. Is it that we want to say, not only to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, was he stringent about the laws of Pasei B'Ra'ot, that he only allows it if it's a be'er of a communal well. Not only that, but he's also stringent when it comes to a karpaf, carrying in a karpaf. Because it's very strange, these two are connected. They're two different laws entirely. We moved from Pasei B'Ra'ot to laws of karpaf and carrying on Shabbat within this space. Two different halachot, but what's similar about them? They're both stringencies. There he said, in our case, in the karpaf, he says it has to be hukaf l'dira. Has to be that someone is actually planning to live there, that there's signs of someone living. So if you want to say that they're both lechumra, well, and that's why mishum hachi katane va'od, that doesn't make sense. And here we go back to, and this is why I brought all the earlier Mishnayot to show you that if you look at Mishnah Gimel and Mishnah Daled, you have the same thing by Rabbi Yehuda. The ha Rabbi Yehuda detane lechad lechumra v'katane achrite. He had one stringency, and then he had another one. V'lo katane ve'od, and it doesn't say there ve'od. So let's look back and let's see. So if you don't have the sheet in front of you, you can look back at the Mishnayot, first on Yud Chet. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it's at the, where is it in Yud Chet? It's right at the top of Yud Chet Amud Aleph. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it's actually the first Mishnah by us, but in the Sefer Mishnayot, it's actually Mishnah number 3, the first one split up. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad Beit Sa'atayim. So he said you're only allowed the Pasei B'Ra'ot in a space of ad Beit Sa'atayim. That's a chumrah. Remember? And then the rabbis responded, and what did they say? Amru lo amru Beit Sa'atayim ela legina ula karpaf. Aval im hayad dir osor or muktzah chatzer afilu Beit Chamesh korim afilu Beit. Right? They said to him, what are you talking about? This Beit Sa'atayim has nothing to do with Pasei B'Ra'ot. The Beit Sa'atayim is only when we're talking about karpaf and carrying inside there. That's how we got on this whole tangent of karpaf. But he said the stringency applied also to Pasei B'Ra'ot. The space was bigger than Beit Sa'atayim. Remember, we had the whole question, is it just the be'er or is it the whole space? Anyway, that's a chumrah. And the next Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imayta derech harabim b'pasaktan, remember that? If the derech rabim goes right through the Pasei B'Ra'ot, Yisalkena litzdadim. You have to move the Rishut Rabim to the side because if a lot of people walk through, that cancels the mechitzot. And the rabbi said, no, it doesn't. So again, he was stringent. So you have the exact same thing, and notice what word is missing there. doesn't say the word ve'od, and furthermore. So the Gemara is going to have to come up with a distinction between the two. Now, there's two options for the Gemara. Either the Gemara could come up with a different explanation, or they could stick with their original explanation, which is what they're going to do, and say, really, it is because there's two stringencies of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. But then they'd have to explain, why doesn't it say va'od? How is the case of Rabbi Yehuda different than Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? So they say, hatam there afsikua rabanan, hachalo ifsikua rabanan. Here, there was no opinion in the middle. It said Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says this, and then it says Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says that. In those Mishnayot, it said Rabbi Yehuda said Beit Sa'atayim, and then we actually have two things. It's interesting. It's more than what the Gemara says. Number one, we have the opinion of the rabbis who basically say, what are you talking about? This law you're talking about, Beit Sa'atayim, that measurement, has nothing to do with Pasei B'Ra'od. It only has to do with Karpav. And then, if you notice right after where I underlined on the sheet, there's one last line, which is another line of the Mishnah before we move on. Umutar laharchik kol shu b'vad she'reb pasim. You can go as far as you want, according to the rabbis, as long as you put up posts. So the rabbis basically disagree about that, right? And then they kind of add another thing. That's why it doesn't say va'od, because the rabbis appear in the middle. So va'od, we have to refer back to something it said 2 sentences ago. So now the Gemara wants a question. Is that really true that they never use va'od if there's a dissenting opinion in the middle? Well, let's see inside. But here I'm going to show you something in Masechet Sukkah, which I put on the sheet also. Okay, so in Masechet Sukkah in Perek Bet, there's 2 Mishnayot where Rabbi Eliezer appears, and it says the word va'od, and lo and behold, the rabbis appear in the middle of that. So that basically rejects what we just claimed. Okay, so let's read it inside. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, According to Rabbi Eliezer, you have to eat 14 meals in the sukkah. You have a chiyuv, an obligation, to eat 2 meals a day, which we mean making hamotzi. Okay, we don't hold this way, but you would have to eat on eat bread in the sukkah 2 full meals a day. No, if you decide not to eat, you don't have to, or you decide not to, decide not to have bread, you don't have to actually have a formal meal. Okay, you could just snack all day if you want. You could end up eating things that don't require sukkah, and then you don't have to eat in the sukkah. They say, only the first night of Yantif, you have to do it. And here comes the ve'od, after the rabbis interjected. If you forgot to eat that first meal, you have to make it up later on. Okay, there's all different ways of understanding that line. We're not going to get into that. But the important part is, it says va'od, and the rabbis were in the middle there, just like Rabbi Yehuda. So why doesn't it say va'od by us? So we're back to square one. If you want to say it's because he was stringent, and it wanted to say, and he has this stringency also, just like Rabbi Eliezer there, then we still don't understand why doesn't it say it by Rabbi Yehuda, because he also has 2 stringencies, and yet it doesn't say va'od. So they're going to distinguish. They're going to distinguish between Sukkah and Rabbi Yehuda in the beginning of our parak. When it comes to Sukkah, the rabbis basically said, we disagree with you about 14 meals. You don't need to eat 14 meals, right? You can eat even 1 meal, right? As long as it's 1 meal, you're fine, the first meal. But here, when the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, they went off on a tangent onto a different topic. They kind of left the topic of Pasei B'Ra'od, and they started discussing the topic of Karpav. And because of that, and a ginah, right, a garden and this big enclosure. Because of that, they left the topic of Pasei B'Ra'od for momentarily. So when we came back, we were no longer at our original topic, and therefore it didn't say va'od. It's a bit of a kvetch, but that's the answer they give. They try to come up with some distinction, and that explains why it says va'od there, and it doesn't say va'od here. This, by the way, if again, the Mishnayot were not all written by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. If he wrote them all, we would expect them all to be consistent. Remember, we brought 2 Breitot the other day and said, well, the Breitot aren't necessarily one right next to, we're written in the same place. Here, you could also say the same thing by Mishnah. It could be this Mishnah, these Mishnayot were kind of in one school, these were from another. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put them together, and he didn't necessarily edit them so that the structure is always the same. It's also a possible explanation. Okay, moving on in the Mishnah. In the Gemara, but relating to the next line in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva Omer, afilu ein ba'echad mikol elu metaltalim b'tochad. You don't need hekef l'dira. You don't need a bore or a ditch or something like that to serve man. No, as long as it's an enclosure that has walls and it's a beit sa'atayim or less, and what does he say? 70 2/3 by 70 2/3, square shape, then it's okay. So now they say, wait a minute, Rabbi Akiva, Hainu Tanakama. He's saying the same thing as Tanakama. Who's Tanakama? Okay, we didn't have a Tanakama. Tanakama is usually an unnamed Tana. So sometimes Tanakama refers to one of the earlier opinions, and actually Rabbeinu Chananel thinks it's referring to Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, but we're going to go with Rashi. Rashi says it's Tanakama way back on Daf Yudchet. Okay, what was that? When the rabbi said, Lo amru beit sa'atayim ela leginau karpaf, basically what are the rabbis saying? Remember, this is what we keep talking about. The rabbis basically say the beit sa'atayim is the shiur for the karpaf. And that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying, right? That if it's more than beit sa'atayim in an enclosure or a garden, then even if you have mechitzot, it doesn't matter, you can't carry. That sounds like exactly what Rabbi Akiva is saying, because both of them talk about where it wasn't hukaf l'dira. Okay, so they seem to be saying the same thing. So the Gemara says, and now I'll get back to what I said about how this number is not exact. Remember, it only comes out to 4,994. And as the Rambam says, it's very hard to get to the exact calculation of how to get to 5,000. Right? What the square root of 5,000 is a very inexact number. So he says, Ika beinayu davar mu'at. The difference, the halacha between them is that little extra. Okay, meaning, now, this is why I read it very carefully when I read Rabbi Akiva. What does he say? Go back to what he says. Afilu ein ba'achat mikol elu, right? Okay, that's not the important part. Ubilvad sheheba shiv'im ama v'shirayim al shiv'im ama v'shirayim. But any more than that is a problem. Meaning, the davar mu'at, the little bit more, that a beit karpaf is really a little bit larger than 70 2/3 by 70 2/3. Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold by that. He says, we go by the measurement of 70 2/3. Whereas the rabbis who use the language, the Tanakama in the other Mishnah, use the language up, beit sa'atayim, they meant exactly 5,000. So if your space is a little bit larger than 70 2/3, right, we're talking fractions, the rabbis would say it's okay, you could still carry in this enclosure, and Rabbi Akiva would say it's not okay. Because Rabbi Akiva says, right, we don't count the davar mu'at. The davar mu'at basically becomes null and void, not relevant. Titania. Okay, now, where do we get this davar mu'at? So I already told you because I did the calculation. But they're going to do it in a bit of a different way. Davar mu'at, yesh al shiv'im ama v'shirayim. Oh, sorry, let's read it better. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, davar mu'at yesh al shiv'im ama v'shirayim. There's a little bit more than 70 2/3. V'lo natnu bo chachamim shiur. But the rabbis didn't actually give it an amount. B'kama shiur. What's the shiur of this sat? It's satayim kechatzer hamishkan. What's the 70 2/3 made up? It's like the satayim of the mishkan. So now they want to know menane mile. Where do we get this measurement from, and where do we get this davar mu'at from? Okay, for this it's going to be very helpful to use the charts. Okay, which I'll send out in the WhatsApp group, and you can find also on the both on the podcast and the details, and also on the website. Okay, here's the chatzar mishkan. It's 100 by 50. Okay, we're going to get back to this picture in a minute. It's picture number 137. Okay, so first we're going to say that we learned this all from the Chatzar Mishkan. So also I put it on your sheet. No, this part I didn't put on the sheet because I said, look at the pictures. The pictures are way better than any picture I could come up with. So he says like this. Rav Yehuda says, it says in the Pasuk, Orech hachatzer mea ba'ama revachav 50 b'50. Okay, it describes in the Torah the measurements. Now, if you were describing the measurements and it was 100 by 50, what would your pasuk read? It would say, Orech hachatzer mea ba'ama, okay, 100 amma as the pasuk says, v'rachav 50, and it's 50 width. However, the pasuk says, v'rachav 50 b'50. It's 50 wide in 50 or something about another 50. So what is this extra 50 for? Now, this is what we call imeno inyan lezeh, tenei inyan lezeh. Meaning, the context there doesn't need the extra 50. It's obvious that it's 50. You don't need to say 50 in 50. What does in 50 mean? Can't have anything to do with the measurements of the chatzir because we already have those in the verse. So it must be teaching us about something else. What does this mean? B'chamishim is a creative drasha. In fact, the Gemara is going to even ask, what's the pshat of this pasuk? Because that's clearly not the pshat, what we're going to say right now. Right? The pshat is the simple reading. Amra Torah to 50 v'savev 50. Take the other 50 and put it around the 50. Okay, this is basically meaning if you want to take that rectangle and form it into a square, how would you do it? Okay, you would take the other 50 and surround the other 50 with it to make a perfect square. And how would you do that? Again, with mathematical equations, you can come up with it in a particular way, but they're going to do it in a simple way so that the average person can understand this. Okay, even though it's not the most simple thing in the world. So look at this picture. Okay, we have picture number 137 and picture number 138. Picture number 137 is the whole thing. So the yellow square here is basically the first 50. Okay, now we want to basically surround that 50 with the other 50. In order to do that, what are we going to do? We're going to take this 50 by 50 square and we're going to divide it into 10 strips of 10 amot by 50 amot, because the whole thing is 50. So 10 amot times 5, right, by 50 would be 50 by 50. So if we take 4 strips of 50, we're going to now put them around the square, and we're going to end up with a square of 70 by 70 minus the corners, because each one is 50. So we're only going to have a length of 50 on either side, but we're going to have added 10 amot on each side of the square, 4 sides of the square, which basically means we're going to add 20 amot altogether if we measure each side by itself, because we've added 50, right, 10 on each side. So now we have 10 amot of thickness on each side, but we're missing the squares, the corners. How are we going to get to 70? Well, if we take the last strip of 10 by 10 that we didn't yet deal with, and we divide it into 5 equal pieces, then we're going to end up with 5 squares of basically 10 by 10. Follow? Because it's 10 by 50. Divided by 5, we're going to have 5 squares of 10 by 10. 10 by 10 is also equal to 60 tvachim, because each amma is 6 handbreadths. So it's the same as saying 60 by 60. So if we take, before we even get to that, let's just stick with each one is 10 by 10. If we take the 10 by 10 and we put each square, 4 of those squares into the corners, we basically completed our square of 70, okay? Because we now have, right, the 50 by 10, and then the extra 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 by 10, that adds 70. We have a perfect square. That's the easy part, okay? Now we end up with one more square that we have to divide equally around this square. How are we going to do that? So like I said, it's now 60 handbreadths by 2 handbreadths, okay? Because if, it's 60 by 60. If we split that into 30 equal strips, we're going to have 60 strips, 2 handbreadths of thickness, okay? Because that's 30 by 20 by 2 is 60, right? So basically, we're going to take 30 strips that are 2 tvachim. Now, if you take the circumference of this, right, the area around this square, how much is it? It's 280, right? Because it's 70 on each side. 70 times 4 is 280. These strips altogether are basically 300 tvachim, right? 300, sorry, one second. They're strips that are 30, right, 30 by 20. So now we're going to take 30 and put them across, right? We're going to take, sorry, I didn't say it right. It's 300 handbreadths, okay? So we're now going to take them and put them all around the square. So we're going to have 70 on each side. No, sorry, I said it wrong. It's 30 amot, one second. Oh, there's something wrong here. Each one is 60 by 60, 30, right. Sorry, my mistake. It's 30 strips of 2 tvachim width, but they're each 10 amot in height. That's where I went wrong for a minute. They're each 10 amot height because we took that little thing that was 10 by 10 and we split it into 30 strips. So they're now 10 cubits long, 2 handbreadths thick, okay? Because it was 60 handbreadths. I just made one little error. Then you basically, so if this is 70 amma plus 70 plus 70 plus 70, we get to 280. So we take 28 of those strips and we put them around, and that completes our square. That's how we get to 70 2/3. Why? Because each one is 2 handbreadths thick, which means that on each side we've added 2 handbreadths, which means that on each side of the square we've added actually 4 handbreadths of thickness. If we've added an enclosed, right, we basically enclosed it with 4 handbreadths of thickness. If that's the case, we now have 4 handbreadths is how much of an amma? 2/3, because an amma is 6. So 4 out of 6 is 2/3. So we now have 70 and 2/3. What's the davar mu'at? Well, we only took 28 of the 30 strips. We still have 2 little strips left that didn't fit in. And that explains why it doesn't get us to the full amount, but it does explain what we wanted to learn here is how we got to this square. And the halacha, this explains to us why in the beginning, what did we say? We said, where did we get a square from the Chatzer Mishkan? So going back to this verse, what did we basically do? We said, the verse says, Orech HaChatzer me'ah ba'amah v'rochav 50 b'50. The drasha is that in the case of a karpaf, we turn the 50 into we put it around the 50 and we create a square. And when it comes to laws of karpaf, you need a square. Okay, and now we're going to debate, do you need a square or it can be a square? Okay, but that's how we get to 70 and 2/3. Okay, it's basically, again, you could get there by saying that what's the square root of 5,000, but they didn't speak in those terms. So they kind of did it in this way where we said, okay, take this, take that, do cut and paste and come up with it all around. Okay. So let me just review very briefly because I see there's some questions about this. I also was confused when I started learning it. So I'll just do it one more time. Okay, so we have a rectangle of 100 of length. We take one square of 50 by 50, another square by 50 of 50. We want to now take one square of 50 and surround it. We surround it by these 10 strips of 50 by 10. That's going to add thickness of 70 all around, but it's missing the corners. We take the 4 squares of the last strip that we didn't take of the 50 by 50. We took 4 strips. We have one more strip. We divide it into 10 by 10. We put 10 by 10 in each corner. That makes it 70. So we now have strips of 70 all around. We filled in 70 by 70. And then we take the last one, divide it into 30 equal parts of each strip is 2 handbreadths by 10 amot. If we take those and we make a long line and we make a square out of it, it's basically going to go around the edges. You could say it's a little longer than 70 because it's 70 and a bit. It would have to be a little bit of a tefach. So maybe you'd end up with a little bit more. But that basically creates this strip around the edges of 280. And then you're left with, it would be a little bit longer than 280. And you're left with a little bit more basically. And that's the davar mu'at that doesn't make up the exact 5,000. Okay. So I hope that was that was understandable. The pictures will definitely help if you look at them. So now, so basically we're saying that this verse about the Chatzer Mishkan is teaching you on a drasha level, okay, in the world of extrapolations, that we can basically learn from here the laws of karpaf are square. Okay? So now, Pasha dekrai b'mai k'tiv. What's the simple reading of that verse though? Amar Abaye, ha'ameh mishkan al sfat 50 kedei she'eh 50 amal lefanav ve'esrim amal lechol ruach beruach. The simple reading of the pasuk is 50 b'50. Put the orech. It actually reads like this: the orech hachatzer me'ah ba'amah b'rachav 50, and then it's talking about the mishkan itself b'50. Put it 50 into the chatzer. Meaning, here I put a picture on my sheet. Basically, what they want to say is have a totally empty courtyard of 50. When you get in the first 50, that's exactly where you want the mishkan to be standing. Remember, the mishkan was in the chatzer. The mishkan was 30 by 10. So you basically want to put it centered when you're walking in through the chatzer, put it in the center. Okay, we're going to read it right now. You want to center it so that it's 10 amma width. So 20 amma on one side, 20 on the other. And basically you walk in to the chatzer mishkan, you pass through 50, you get to the middle point. You're now going to see in front of you, centered in the middle, 10 amot of width, 30 amot of length going into, and you're going to basically have 20 on every side, okay? Because there's going to be 20 there, and 20 till you get to the end because it's 30 long, so there's 20 till the end. Okay, but the mishkan itself is 10 width. Okay, so that's the way the simple reading of the verse is. Moving on in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, im hayta orka v'chulei. So now they say, wait a minute. The first way we read Rabbi Eliezer, if you remember, when we saw him in the Mishnah, he says, if the orka is more than the rochav, even in Amah, it sounded like he said only a square. But there's a braita where it says he said otherwise. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, im hayta orka yeter al pishnayim berochba, afilo ma'achat em mitzaltalim b'tocha. He says it can't be a rectangle where the length is more than double the width, which sounds like it could be a rectangle. So in our Mishnah, it sounds like it's a square. So Amar Baby Bar Abaye, Kitna Nami Matnitin Yeter Al Pishnayim Berochba. Really, our Mishnah means rectangle, and it just can't be more than double. Again, where did they get to this amount? More than double is the 100 by 50, right? Where the 100 is double the 50 from the Chatzer, the courtyard of the Mishkan. So he says, change Rabbi Eliezer. What he really means is not the way it looks here. But then they say, Ihachi Hanu Rabbi Yossi, but that doesn't make any sense because then he agrees with the next person. Okay, if you want to look, you can either look back at the Mishnah or you can look on the sheet. So I underline each person's name on the sheet to make it simpler to follow. So there it says, Rabbi Yossi says, Afilu or kapishnayim berachba metaltalim mitocha. It can be double. Right? It can't be more, but it can be double. That sounds like exactly the same thing that we just said Rabbi Eliezer is saying. It can be double. It can't be more than double. So what's the difference between them? Okay, again here, like I mentioned before, there's two different explanations. And by the way, the Steinsaltz in both places holds by Rabbeinu Hananel, but I'm going to go with Rashi's approach. What's the difference between them? The ribua di rivua Rabbanan. Okay, what's the ribua di rivua Rabbanan? It is do we want specifically, does it have to be specifically a square? Or can it be, in other words, do we want a square but a rectangle is okay? Or is a rectangle great? In other words, is the square ideal? It's just you can manage with a rectangle? Or is there no such thing as a square is ideal? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, who basically words it as im hayta or ka yeter aruchba, if it's, and then we basically mean, right, if it was yeter pishnayim, then it works, right? And that's what he's saying basically is if it's more than double, it's a problem. Basically sounds like, but any rectangle is great as long as it's not double length to width. But Rabbi Yossi, who says afilu or kapishnayim berachban, notice says even if its length is double, it's okay. Meaning, even if it's a rectangle, it's okay, but ideally it should be a square. And that's what, according to Rashi. Okay, again, like I said, if you look in the Koren, they're going to have a different explanation based on Steinsaltz's commentary. It's a different way based on Rabbeinu Hananel. Okay, but I'm going with Rashi. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi says, now we're back to Rabbi Yossi, who we just quoted, that if it's more than double, right, even if it's rectangular, it's okay, as long as it's not double. Itma. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halakha ke Rabbi Yossi. Okay, we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Again, Rabbi Yossi is bringing us the halakha in the name of Rav Yehuda and the name of Shmuel. We paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Rav Baby Bar Abai, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, he also said, halakha ke Rabbi Akiva. Remember I told you that there's two different things going on in the Mishnah. There's one issue about, does it need to be hukaf l'dira? Does there need to be some sort of living going on? We paskin like Rabbi Akiva, you don't. And when it comes to the size, you don't necessarily need a square. You can have a rectangle, okay? So we paskin leniently on both counts. So now they want to know, right? They basically say utravayu l'kula, and both are leniencies. So why did you need to say both? You could have just said, right? We paskin like him and kind of assumed if we're lenient there, we're lenient there. So now they're going to say, no, why would you have not thought that? Utsrifa, and halakha ke Rabbi Yossi, and this is basically just obvious. If you said we paskin like Rabbi Yossi, he was only addressing one issue. So you would have thought, havamina adika shomira o beitira. You might have thought he does require, though it can be rectangular, but it does require some sort of living facility. That's why we say, halakha is like Rabbi Akiva, you don't need any sort of living space. You might have thought, remember, he says 70 and 2/3 by 70 and 2/3, maybe it has to be exactly a perfect square. So, and therefore it says, halakha ke Rabbi Yossi, to teach you both. Okay, we'll quickly start the next case. Karpaf yoter mi beit sa'atayim. Now we're having a halacha, we have a karpaf. It's made up of two parts. First, it's more than a beit sa'atayim, and it's hukaf l'dira. So it's a living space, which means you can carry in here. But now they say, nizra rubo hareu kigina. If you plant in the majority of that space, you turned it into a gina, which now you can't carry in that space because it's no longer living space. You don't live in a place where there's plants planted, right, where there's crops. But natarubo, if he planted, nata is the word for trees. If he planted trees in the majority of it, now people do live among trees. First of all, you could sleep under a tree. It's more of a living space. Then it doesn't cancel out the whole space. Hareu kechatzer mutal. You can carry in this whole area. But now they say nizra rubo. In the case of nizra rubo, we're now going to narrow the focus a little. We're going to say it's not true across the board that it's going to mess you up. Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua lo amaran ela yoter mibeit sa'atayim. Aval beit sa'atayim mutar. If the space where you planted, and here I put it on the sheet also, a little chart, if the space where you planted is a beit sa'atayim, just the space where you planted, okay, the whole thing was more than a beit sa'atayim. The space you planted was a beit sa'atayim or less, then he says you can actually still use it as a space, okay? It's mutar, because it's a gina that's less than beit sa'atayim, and that's allowed to be carried in. Right, so lo amaran ela yoter mibeit sa'atayim. If it's bigger than a beit sa'atayim, then it becomes a problem. Why? Kiman ki Rabbi Shimon. This holds like Rabbi Shimon. Now we learned this already in Masechet Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon omer, echad gagot, echad chatzirot, echad karpipot, l'shut echadim lekelim sheshavtu b'tocham v'lo lekelim sheshavtu b'toch habayit. He had this unique opinion that everything that's not generally meant for living, you can carry from one to the other. So you can carry from a chatzer to a karpaf, etc. Now, if we have this space, originally it was a big courtyard. You now planted part of it. Your planted part becomes a gina. Your original part that's not planted in is still a chatzer. So you now have a chatzer and a gina right next to each other. The gina, if it's less than beit sa'atayim, okay, then, or no, let's say it's more than beit sa'atayim. Well, okay, let's say it's less. If it's less than beit sa'atayim, then you're allowed to carry in the gina. And according to Rabbi Shimon, you're allowed to carry from a gina to a chatzer, which means, and now we're going to go back to something we talked about before, if something is nifratz, it's open entirely, this is open, there's no fence in between, if it's open entirely to a space that's forbidden to you, you're not allowed to carry. It forbids that space also. But this, according to Rabbi Shimon only, one can carry from one to the other. There are two different spaces now. Originally, it was all a courtyard. You planted part of it, now it becomes a gina. According to laws of gina, less than beit sa'atayim or less is allowed to carry. And according to laws of Rabbi Shimon, you can carry from a gina to a chatzer. So you can basically carry from this garden to the courtyard, in which case the whole area is permitted. So he says, if it's a beit sa'atayim or less where you planted, you're actually allowed to carry from one to the other. Whereas if you don't hold by Rabbi Shimon, then basically you don't think you can carry in the gina or you can carry in the chatzer, but since these are open to each other and you can't carry from one to the other, then the whole thing is forbidden. Okay, so that's what we're basically saying. This has to all look like Rabbi Shimon. Tomorrow we'll ask some questions on this, but we'll end with here today, and I'll review this sugya tomorrow when we start. So if you didn't get 100% at the end, we'll review it tomorrow morning. Okay. Have a good day, everyone.